Hello everyone, welcome to 12 am coding, and today we are going to start a very interesting playlist which is on Spring Boot. Okay, so on internet and YouTube and all I have seen lots of tutorials of Spring Boot, and in those Spring Boot tutorials people has defined lot of things, right? Like the build tools like Maven, Gradle, and how Spring Boot is having that annotations and those APIs, how we can create the APIs and everything. But the basic soul, the core of Spring Boot, why we use Spring Boot, okay, and the basic benefits of Spring Boot, lot of places it is lacking. So I just plan to define some of the things today, and we will be seeing and all those terminologies we'll be understanding from very base, okay, which are talked about Spring Boot. So first of all, let's think about the object creation, okay, into the Java. So if we talk about the normal Java, I'm not talking about Spring Boot, okay. So what we will do, we will create an object like we are having one class, let's say, okay, this fruit class. So you will be creating, let's say, fr object, and we will be having a new and then new fruit. Okay, so here we are creating the object like this, okay, whenever we need to do in Java. So what I mentioned here, we are creating the object, okay, right? But this in the case of Java. But in the case of Spring Boot, this object creation, we have delegated the task to the Spring Boot, okay? And whenever user need a object, it will tell Spring Boot that I need the object, and Spring Boot will return you the object. So in this particular flow, what we are doing, we are externalizing the object creation. So we have externalized the object creation, okay, and this externalization we can name it as IOC. So I think you guys have heard the term IOC a lot in Spring Boot, which means inversion of control, okay, inversion of control, which is IOC. So IOC is nothing but the inversion. So here we are creating the object. Here we inverted the control. We are telling someone else to create the object for us. We are telling Spring Boot. So we reverse that particular process. So that's why we say it as IOC, and which is means externalization. Okay, externalization of object creation. Okay, I think this IOC is making sense now, that we just reverse this flow. We are not creating the object. We are telling Spring Boot to create the object. And whenever we need the object, we will avail that object. We will take that object. Okay, so this is about IOC. And one more term we are having is a IOC container. Okay, so let me make a little box here and let's name it as IOC container. Okay, what this container means? This container carries all your objects. So for example, hundreds of objects it will carry. Whatever Spring Boot will be having the objects, it will be having into this IOC container. So when user requests a object, then it will be going to IOC container and it will be seeing, are you having some object? And then it will be giving the object to the user. So lot of concept of this Spring Boots are related to this particular IOC container only. Okay, we'll be talking it about in detail now. So there is one thing which is known as application context also. So we covered IOC container, okay, and normal IOC, inversion of control. So there is one more term which is application, okay, application context. Application context is nothing but a way to develop a IOC container, okay, and to achieve this inversion of control actually, we can say. To achieve the inversion of control, we use application context. So we can use these terms vice versa, like IOC, either you can use um, IOC and or you can use application context. Okay, so this is the basic of IOC container and application context. So what we'll be doing? We'll be doing a simple thing. If we are having a user, okay, that user will be asking the IOC container or application context for the object, okay, and he will request for the object and this IOC container will give object back to the user. Okay, this is our basic flow. Now one more thing comes into the mind is like in this IOC container, how it knows which objects to keep. Okay, so we are having this IOC container. In this IOC container, what I am saying, we can have multiple objects. What objects needs to be there into this IOC container? So for that, we need to, like, let's say in our Spring Boot, okay, in your Spring Boot project, we are having lots of classes. Okay, multiple classes are there. So it's not like that it will contains objects of all the classes. No, some special classes actually we can say special classes objects it will be containing. So what special classes are there? So I guess you heard about the annotation which is at the rate component. Okay, so any class which is decorated with this particular annotation, okay, then only that IOC container will create the object of that one. And what exactly it does, whenever we start the Spring Boot application, right? Whenever the Spring Boot application is started, what it does, it scans actually, okay? It scans the classes which is having the at the rate component annotation, okay? Which is having the at the rate component annotation, okay? And those classes, okay, those particular classes it will be putting into our IOC container. Okay, I think this is making sense that in the Spring Boot application what we are talking about, that the class which is having the at the rate component annotation, it the object of that particular class will be automatically gone into the IOC container. Okay, I think this is making the sense. Now, like we can discuss about this annotation also. So annotation can be put over the class, okay, it can also be put over any interface, okay, or it can put over any method, okay, and any field also actually. So we'll be discussing about in some separate tutorial about the annotations, but we can just for now we can just take it as it contains some info actually. Okay, this annotation contains some info, and that information you can apply on any class or interface or method or field. So what we just discussed about it, if we are having a class, for example, I'm having one class which is, let's say, my component, okay, and let's say public, uh, and that then void, and this particular class we are having. So if this particular class is having at the rate component annotation, then the bean actually, in the Spring Boot terms, object we call it as bean. Its bean will be registered into your IOC container. Okay, so this is the particular thing that in Spring Boot we call it as bean. Okay, and bean is nothing but a object in Spring Boot terms. If we call it as, in Java we call it as object, in Spring Boot if it comes we can call it as bean. And there are multiple things about bean, we will be discussing about this particular topic later. So the bean of this component or any class which is having the at the rate component annotation, Spring Boot will scan all those classes and put it into your IOC container. So I think this is clear now. Okay, so now let's discuss about one more important thing which is in Spring Boot, which is one annotation which is at the rate Spring Boot application. Okay, so if I show you the code in this particular, like I just created a Spring Boot project, okay, from start.spring.io. In this particular project, this particular class, every Spring Boot project will be having, okay, and on this particular class, we will be having at the rate Spring Boot application, and this particular class is the entry point for our application. Okay, so what I'm saying, in a Spring Boot application, the main class in which our main method exists, so whenever we run this application, this will be seeing for this particular class, and this application will be running. And wherever the at the rate Spring Boot application annotation is there, that particular class will be the entry point for your application. Okay, now one more thing, this Spring Boot application annotation, it is combination of these particular annotation, okay, which is at the rate configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. Okay, so let's understand this particular thing one by one. Okay, like what are these annotations and exactly how it works. Okay, so let's talk about first this particular annotation. Okay, which is component scan. Okay, let's go from bottom. So in this component scan, what happens whenever we just talk about the IOC container, right? We are having the IOC container here. Okay, in this particular IOC container, whenever at the rate component annotation, okay, any class will be having this at the rate component annotation, then that bean will be registered, right? We just talked about it. Okay, so this bean we will put into our IOC container. So what happens that this particular component scan annotation is used to enable scanning of components. Okay, so we can understand this particular annotation as let's go to our project and see. So whenever this Spring Boot application is present, it means at the rate component scan. If I open this particular annotation, then you can see at the rate component scan annotation inside it. What does it means? That in the package where your Spring Boot application is present, in that particular package, the classes which is having at the rate component annotation, those will be registered as a bean into the IOC container. Okay, so let me explain this particular thing again, that the class which is having your Spring Boot application annotation, your at the rate component scan annotation will scan all those classes to create a bean into IOC container, which is present into this particular package where your Spring Boot application is existed. Okay, the main class will be existing. So let me explain it that way. For example, I just create some example for you to make you understand better. So let's say one thing we will do now. Okay, let me create one more package actually. Okay, let me create one more package. Com dot example dot anything. Okay, let me name it as anything only. Okay, and if you see, our main class Spring Boot application classes existed in Spring Demo package. Okay, now I am creating one new class. For example, I'll create a class as, okay, animal. Okay, and this animal I'll annotate with at the rate component. Okay, and let's say I'll create one function. Okay, public string and then animal eat actually. Okay, and for example, I'll make it as it will return you animal eat fruits. Okay, for example, I'm just giving like this. Okay, and at the rate component annotation I have provided into this particular class. So what I'm trying to define is this particular Spring Boot application is present into R this package, and I have created one class out of this particular package. Okay, and I have defined at the rate component. Now let's see if it works. So in this Spring demo, what I will do, I will create one more class. Okay, and this fruit class I'll make it as REST controller. Okay, just bear with me for a few minutes, you will be understanding this better. And now what I'll be doing, I'll be auto wiring animal class. Okay, and I'll be creating one more get mapping. I'll tell each and everything in few minutes. Just be with me, and I'll be doing here void, and then I'll be creating one method. Okay, and this method, what it will be doing, it will be returning me animal dot eat. Okay, so okay, it will be returning a string actually. Okay, because this particular eat method is returning a string. So what I have done, I have created a class which is named as fruit, and I have created as a REST controller. So REST controller also internally it is having component scan actually like at the rate component. Okay, if you see In REST controller, we are having at the rate controller, and in at the rate controller, we are having component. So what I have told, right, that the class which is having at the rate component directly or indirectly, the bean of that will be created into the IOC container. So in the same way, fruit bean will also be created. And this I create one API actually. I have created one API which is having default path as slash, okay, and which will be returning you the animal dot eat, okay, and this animal class is having at the rate component. So I have defined at the rate autowire annotation. I'll tell you about this particular annotation after some time. So what it should do whenever I should call this API, okay, then this particular method, the API will return us animal eat fruit, okay, and this animal class is outside our Spring Boot application package. Okay, so let me run it and show. You'll understand it better. Okay, so some error came actually. So let's see this particular error. So what it is saying, consider defining a bean of type animal in your configuration. So this is what I was talking about, that at the rate component scan, right? This particular annotation in the Spring Boot application annotation, this present inside it, right? This will see the classes which are present into this particular package only. Okay, and if the class is outside this package, for example our animal, it will not be able to provide the bean to us. So for example, rather than auto wire, so auto wiring is nothing, we'll be talking about it, it's a dependency injection. What auto wire exactly will do, let me tell one thing first and then I'll be coming back to this. Let's say I'll do new animal. Okay, so I'm not auto wiring, I have just created the object with myself. Okay, now let me run this application. So let's see what happens. So this application is started. Okay, and now let me go to Google and do 8080 port. My default application is running. So if you see animal eats fruit, this particular call happened and we call this particular method. So right now what we did, we just created the object by ourselves. We are not using the Spring Boot beauty to get the object. That's why. Okay. So let me tell you now about the AutoWire annotation. Uh, Okay, so this thing we did. Now, one more thing I want to do is let me remove this particular object creation like this, because like in this case what you did, right? You just created a new object by yourself. So Spring Boot in this particular project, it knows that we are having an existing class animal somewhere. Okay, now let me uncomment this AutoWire also and let me put it inside this particular package. Okay, let me refactor it. So what I have done, if you see, I have enabled the auto wired again. Okay, and I put the animal which is having at the rate component inside our application package only, where Spring Boot application exists. Inside this package, you can create multiple packages. That's a different thing. Now let me run this. Okay, so let's see, it started. Now let me run this, and if you see, again it came animal eat fruit. So at the back behind the scene, what is happening is when we define the auto wire, what it is doing exactly, let me explain you. Okay, so in the as I told you, right, that we are having a IOC container. Okay, this IOC container we are having, what Spring Boot did, so whatever packages, okay, which are inside your at the rate Spring Boot application, okay, the classes which are present under this particular package where your Spring Boot application exists, it will scan the classes and put inside the IOC container. This is what it does. Okay, but what we did, that we put our animal class with the at the rate component, like if you provide at the rate component or not provide, but it is not visible to this, right, because this is due to at the rate component scan. So your Spring Boot will only scan the packages which are present inside your Spring Boot application package. Outside the package, it is not able to scan it. So that's why it did not put this particular object into your IOC. Okay, so this is what. And now what I did, I just moved this animal inside this package currently. Okay, and I just created with myself the object, right, with the new, so it was working. But if we need to use the auto wire, and I'll be telling you about this thing, why we used it and why we are not using equals to new. Okay, we just put this animal into our Spring demo where our Spring Boot application existed, and it started working. Because when you are using auto wire, right, this particular annotation when you are using, and you are providing animal with the animal without any new keyword, what it is doing, it is going to Spring Boot IOC container. So your this uh, animal object, okay, is is the object inside the fruit class. So your fruit class is dependent upon animal, okay, and this dependency you are injecting from IOC. Okay, so your fruit class is needing this particular animal, so IOC will be providing you the object. Now I told you, right, that you can without AutoWire also, if you provide new, right, here animal, then also you can call it. And if let's say I restart this, okay, I showed you, right, it was working. So if I restart it, it will work because we have initialized this particular object. Okay, we are not using the Spring Boot object. So what does it make sense, right? If we don't use the AutoWire, then our Spring Boot things will not be making any sense. So that's why we are using auto wiring. This is known as the dependency injection. When we are injecting any object or any dependency from Spring Boot IOC container. Okay. And why we are using the dependency injection? Because here you can create this object. So what it will do, it will create a new object. Now let's say currently we are having fruit class only. Tomorrow we can have thousands of classes. In thousands of classes, let's say we need to use the animal. Then what you will do? You will create animal, new animal 1,000 times. It will create 1,000 object. It will occupy more space, right? So that's why Spring Boot, what it will do, it will create this object one time only into this IOC container. Okay. And in this IOC container, whenever we define any of the class object with @AutoWire, what it will do, rather than creating a new object, it will go to the IOC container and return you the object. So I think it is making sense. Okay. So let me just refresh everything that first of all we read about it, that in Spring Boot we need a @component annotation to put that particular bean or object into IOC container. Okay. And how Spring Boot knows with the which class to create the bean, with component scan, which is present inside our Spring Boot application annotation. And this Spring Boot application annotation, wherever this is present in the package, it will scan all those classes inside that package only, not outside. Right? We have seen that example that if we put the animal outside the Spring demo, okay, it was not working because it was not finding that object into IOC container. Okay, so this was the thing. Now I think this particular component scan is clear. Second thing comes is enable auto configuration. So this annotation is for, like, let's say you want to enable some configuration, you are using some databases or other things, right? So it will automatically enable those configuration. So for example, in my Spring Boot project, what I did, I need a MySQL. Okay, and you provided the dependency into your build.gradle. So you don't need to explicitly define the configuration for MySQL. This Spring Boot application will automatically enable the configuration for your MySQL. Like you can disable it also if you don't want the auto configuration. There are different mechanisms. Okay, so this was that. Now third comes is our configuration. Okay, this is our third annotation, configuration. So configuration is also a kind of component scan, but there are some differences. Okay, so it is for configuration actually. So let's say in your project you need some configuration, you need some multiple beans inside the classes. So this is actually related to bean annotation. So in this, if in this one class we are having and we decorated with the configuration, okay, in that case, the internal classes if you define or internal beans you will be creating, it will be creating one time only. Actually, we will be discussing this particular topic later, this bean, and we can discuss that configuration and component difference also in that particular tutorial. So yes, guys, that's it for this particular tutorial. And I think now it makes much more sense how this Spring Boot and how this IOC container application context and this dependency injection auto wired it is working. Okay, so yeah, that's it for this particular tutorial. Let's see you in the next tutorial. Thank you.